Dreams become reality with a perfect platform. Give wings to your ambition. Ignite it with power, with creativity, and let it fly. Let it fly high to reach the sky. Let your passion lead you. Take you places. Script your success story. Dreams become reality with a perfect platform. Give wings to your ambition.
அப்போ ஹேஷ்டேக்
You're happy and you know it, clap your hands. If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands. If you watch it and you know it, and you really want to show it. If you watch it and you know it, clap your hands. If you watch it and you know it, clap your hands. If you watch it and you know it, clap your hands. If you watch it and you know it, and you really want to show it. The fire.
For you, 'cause you're there for me too. I'll be there for you. I'll be there for you. I'll be there for you, 'cause you're there for me too.
Sneha? Yes, Sneha, we will start.
One cannot make architecture without studying the condition of life in the city by Aldo Rossi. Our only limitations are those that we set up in our mind. A very good morning to everyone present here. A very warm welcome to hashtag 21, Unlock Loop of Respect. This year, we are celebrating 4 years of hashtag in our department, School of Environment, Architecture and Design, SEED. I am Sneha, a first-year student of SRMC, Ramapuram. Also, it is my humble request to keep your microphone and videos muted throughout the session for a hassle-free session. If you have any questions, feel free to type it in the chat box. It will be answered by the end of the session. I would like to thank our title sponsor, Madan's Makeover, a tailor-made salon. We, SRM Seed Ramapuram, are honored to have this session with a profound architect, Mohammed Ali Sharieff, sir. I would like to request our VP Admin, Seed, Architect, Lokesh Mathivanan, sir, to welcome Architect Sharieff, sir.
My wholehearted welcome, sir, Architect Mohammed Ali Sharieff, sir. Thank you for accepting our invite.
Thank you, Lokesh.
And thank you, sir. Thank you so much, sir. And I have seen your works. It was very impressive. And also, you are encouraging and motivating the students very well. That's why I want you to give your motivational speech and, you know, the inspiration to the students also, sir. Actually, that is the reason. We just wholeheartedly welcome you from our Seed family, sir. On behalf of SRM Seed, I thank our management, Chairman Dr. R. Shivakumar, sir, and Co-Chairman, and our Chief Director and Director, and Dean ENT and Dean KTR for this wonderful, tremendous support they gave. And this event is fully hosted by students, sir. Students are the real heroes. And they themselves running the show, they're taking leadership, they are just carry out the show very well. And hashtag is our pride. Past 4 years we are doing hashtag in a next level manner. This time also we will do it better. Thank you, sir. Thank you for accepting our invite.
Thank you,
sir.
My pleasure.
Thank you, sir. That was a lovely welcome. Let me take this opportunity of introducing our speaker now. Architect Mohammed Ali Sharieff, sir, is currently undergoing his doctoral research in urban planning, Department of Architecture, University of Naples Federico, Italy. He is a Government of Italy scholarship recipient. He has finished his master's from Indian Institute of Technology, Roorkie, and UG from Thiagaraja College of Engineering, Madurai. He has worked with several architectural firms across India and also have headed Karpagam School of Architecture and Sasi Creative School of Architecture at Coimbatore. He has received Young Teacher Award from the IIT-Tamil Chapter for his academic excellence. Without further delay, on behalf of SEED, I invite Architect Mohammed Ali Sharieff, sir, to deliver his webinar.
Thank you, Sneha. Thank you very much. Am I audible?
Yes, sir. Yes.
Okay. First of all, I'd like to thank my good friend, Professor Ravi, for inviting me to this webinar, to Professor Shantini and Sneha for the introduction. Thanks also to the conveners, the event coordinators, my good friends, Professor Asok and Professor Lokesh, student conveners, and the entire team of hashtag 2021 for this wonderful opportunity to be part of this webinar. It makes me more happy because this is a completely student organized event. I feel very proud to be a part of this now. My best regards to everyone at SEED SRM Ramapuram, and I pray great success follows hashtag 2021 through the unlocking of experiences and knowledge loops that hashtags are meant to enable. Good afternoon, participants, organizers, and guests. The unlocking of our ways of doing and learning requires new thinking, relearning, unlearning, and redoing what we know and what we have been doing in architecture, planning, and design. This will enable us to extend the scope of our knowledge realms and make lives better for everyone. It is laudable how the organizers have included a very good diversity of speakers, very wonderful events, and fun-filled activities to provide some good respite from the COVID times through positive distraction and fruitful engagement. And I hope to make my very small contribution through this lecture. Please allow me to share my screen. It is very a kind of a difficult times that we're going through with the COVID pandemic and the continuous waves that we are seeing. As we've just completed our second wave, Europe has done its third and possibly entering its fourth. And the Delta variant is in full swing. It's taken a lot of toll. In this scenario, it was very important for me to highlight the key aspect of my lecture. And I call it informal settlements, despair or hope. Because the situation here definitely requires this question to be asked of one of despair or hope. And we are seeing different sides appearing at different times in our lives. And through this lecture, I would also like to open avenues for thought processes as to how poor and marginalized communities survive and possibly how they're also overcoming this pandemic situation. So please allow me to begin. Can I switch off my video? So I'll have better bandwidth.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. You can.
So our cities are complex, challenging, conflicting, and contested social-spatial environments. They require us to constantly and consistently engage and imagine them in new ways. One of the most raging debates among scholars globally today is that of the ways and means for re-understanding and transformation of the urban as from sites of power, profit, productivity, and prejudice to sites of life-making, solidarity, care, and humanity. Institutions, policies, and systems are increasingly facing severe critique for the rising inequalities and inadequacies so prevalent in our cities today. The stark differences in socioeconomic and physical conditions are a reality in urban areas across the world today, to a lesser or greater extent. The inequalities in income, education, health, sanitation, housing, physical and social infrastructure are visible as spatial divisions. Inequalities also exist as the conditions that allow for certain groups to dominate over others as power relationships. In India, for many of us, this is a daily reality we encounter and experience. Yet some inequalities can often go unnoticed. It is with this dimension and perspective I present today's brief lecture on informal settlements to provoke your thoughts and help imagine the contemporary urban scenario as one of despair or hope for the poor and marginalized peoples. I begin by sharing the work of Johnny Miller, a professional documentary photographer and multimedia storyteller from South Africa. He uses his camera to explore inequality, architecture, displacement, and climate justice from the ground and from the air. His photo series titled Unequal Scenes of Mumbai, Rio de Janeiro, Mexico City garnered widespread praise and was featured in many publications. He seeks to portray the discrepancies in how people live in the world as objectively as possible by capturing communities of extreme wealth and privilege existing just meters from squalid conditions and shack dwellings. These discrepancies exist as social, economic, political, ecological entanglements and spatial reflections of the patterns of inequalities. Since 2018, Miller has expanded his series and photographed several cities in the US, Mexico, Tanzania, Kenya, and India. Each of these places have different forms and urban morphologies specific to their respective contexts. However, the ruptures remain, conditioning and limiting social and spatial development. One of the most glaring socio-spatial inequalities visible today in all urban regions, especially in the global south, are the informal settlements, more commonly referred to as slums in most development writing. Informal settlements, areas where groups of housing units are on land that are illegally occupied and which the occupants have no claim to. There are also unplanned settlements and areas where housing is not in compliance with planning and building regulations. This is from the glossary of the United Nations. But there is dispute here of whether informal settlements are unplanned or self-planned. This image here is of an informal settlement along the Wallangalam Lake in Coimbatore. This was shot in early 2014 during an urban study conducted by a small group of students and professors of the Faculty of Architecture at Karpagam University. And today this settlement does not exist, having given way for the Lake Rejuvenation Beautification Scheme as part of the Coimbatore Smart City project. But this urban study was the trigger for further exploration of the frictions and the informal arrangements that are continuously produced in the urban. But before we hear these stories of despair and hope, it is necessary to repeat the origin and story of the word slum. The word slum first came into formal use in the 1820s. It had its origins in the old provincial word slump, meaning wet mire or swamp, that roughly described the dreadful state of the street on these undrained locations. It was colloquially used to refer to hidden away rooms of low repute. This image here shows inhabitants of close number 118 of the High Street in Glasgow, Scotland, taken by Scottish photographer Thomas Annan. He was commissioned by the City Improvement Trust to document the squalid living conditions, which were scheduled for demolition and reconstruction by an Act of Parliament as early as 1866, as a response to the global cholera pandemic. Initially, a convict by the name Henry Fox was actually assigned by the prison authorities in London to create a vocabulary of slang words. And the earliest mention of slum as a back room appeared in Henry's vocabulary. Later, 1912, Webster's dictionary mentions slum as a foul backstreet of a city, especially one filled with a poor, dirty, degraded, and often vicious population, as any low neighborhood or dark retreat. And gradually this term was used to denote certain locations across London and several other cities in Europe, America, and Australia that had the poorest housing quality and the most unhygienic conditions. These locations were reputed for being the breeding grounds for marginal activities, including many criminal activities and drug abuse. The history of Naples in southern Italy, where I live, is a past image of slum and crime, an exaggerated association of the crime mafia with the poor neighborhoods of Scampia and Secondigliano. The Italian drama series Gomorrah was inspired by and taken in this neighborhood in 2014 as a set of 14 episodes. I'm sure somebody would like to explore that. Likewise, in the USA, slum development coincided with the arrival of large number of immigrants in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This image here, taken by Jacob Rees, is titled The Bandit's Roost, and was supposed to expose the city's slums through his photojournalist publication of how the other half lives in New York. Poverty and urban inequality were attributed to Irish immigrants, non-speaking European immigrants, non-English speaking European immigrants, the Chinese, and later people from Africa and South Asia. Ethnic prejudice against immigrants, especially Black Americans, overlapped with even cruder currents of racism, culminating in the slum getting subsumed within the Black ghetto. Racial discrimination and prejudice are what the world is still battling, as evident through the Black Lives Matter protests, which resurfaced after the death of George Floyd exactly a year ago. The slum then was an English linguistic deceit that was exported to British colonial possessions, including India, in which English speakers comprised only a tiny controlling elite rather than a settler majority, and where most of the indigenous populations lived in rural areas. Here, the slum stereotypes took root among both the local elite and the colonizers. Thus, as the original meanings of the word slum eroded in English-speaking nations, they grew in currency as urbanization accelerated in their former colonies. Slum was used to describe the living conditions of the races that Europeans encountered in the cities of the British Empire through imposition and overlaying a diversity of idiomatic words and meanings in other languages, which were largely derogatory, and was adopted by the English-speaking professional, academic, business, and political elites who led these societies as they moved towards independence. This new use of the word gradually translated its meanings from European to non-European societies. Our slums here are often referred to as hupams or sheris, as bastis, as chawls, as jhuggi jhopris, baseras, and the like. The slum thus was orientalized. As colonies became independent nations and incorporated slum stereotypes into their post-colonial development programs, forged partnerships with international aid agencies, and explained their social policies and modernization strategies in international networks and forums, slum became a familiar and credible term throughout the world. In both its original and new meanings, however, slum was a label that was imposed upon socially disadvantaged neighborhoods. Nowhere was the concept organic to the places it described, and nowhere was it undeservedly accepted by the inhabitants of these neighborhoods. Today, this word slum is a catch-all for poor housing of every kind, as well as a label for the environment. However, it is increasingly being discontinued by international agencies, governments, professionals, and academia, and being replaced by the terms informal settlements, marginal settlements, and squatter settlements, as I have preferred to use here. The informal here also truly represents the nature of the people, culture, and regions of India, especially the informal dimensions of urban life. The complexity of the concept of informality involves many spheres. It is used to describe and theorize on not just the spatial aspect of the city, but its cultural, socio-economic, and political organization. Informality is often associated with procedures and phenomena that take place outside formal processes or planned and regulated zones. A wide range of situations may be included, like spontaneous processes of occupation of the territory, absence of property titles, self-building of houses, illegal inhabiting in context with rapid urbanization, temporary uses of space, forms of self-organization and development of urban areas at city fringes. Informality also as an important aspect in villages is the resident population's ability to give shape to a shared landscape with which they satisfy collective needs. In the absence of any type of regulation on space structuring, these informal processes and evidence show a capacity on the part of the inhabitants to establish a relationship between territory, space, and practices. And probably this is what Henry Lefebvre meant when he said the informality phenomena has become a significant element in urban growth and in the production of the city. To take this idea of the informal settlement and of the urban inequalities that we experience and of the right to city and its production processes, I've used two examples, one of Dharavi, Mumbai, and the other of Valangalam in Coimbatore. And I'm going to narrate them as very short stories in order to understand the hidden inequalities that reside therein. In pre-colonial India, the Koli fishing community has settled at the northernmost tip of the island of Parel. Their community was right next to the Mahim Creek. And in the 16th century, when the Portuguese colonists built a small fort and church at Bandra, they did not disturb the Koli fishermen community. In the 18th century, the swamps of Mumbai started to be reclaimed. All the 7 islands were joined into a single landmass. The Mahim Creek dried up soon afterwards due to this reclamation project, and the Koli community at Dharavi lost their source of livelihood and began to disperse towards more promising locations and opportunities. The landscape of Dharavi around the 1850s was a heterogeneous mixture of new industries and local handicrafts. Fishing villages and industrial sheds tore through the swampy lands, punctuated by people dragged carts filled with goods along the dirt roads. The skyline was smokestacks of the textile mills, besides the potter's kilns, which later developed into the Kumarwada, the potter's colony. Opportunities offered by the colonized in industrial Mumbai attracted migrants from Maharashtra, Konkan, and Gujarat, bringing to Dharavi a diversity of artists and aspirants from Saurashtra, from Tamil Nadu, from Uttar Pradesh. Between the 40s and the 60s is the independence period and the post-independence decade. Major eviction drives in Mumbai saw more people relocate to Dharavi, which was still on the outskirts of the city. And as happens in every other city, the authorities ignored it until the city exploded in population and grew northwards to bring Dharavi right into the heart of the new city. Consequent decades saw state governments pass laws for slum area improvement, clearance, and redevelopment, and Dharavi being declared as a slum. The residents were provided with infrastructure, taps, toilets, electricity, sewer and water lines. Transit camps were constructed to house the people. For those households and houses which came in the way of infrastructure projects. Later in 81 and in the last decade of the 20th century, several development schemes by successive governments who launched the slum rehabilitation projects promising free houses to all slum dwellers. In 2003, an American management and consulting firm published a report called Vision Mumbai, transforming Mumbai into a world-class city, with a set of recommendations. And according to the report, the solution to the problems of Mumbai was a step-by-step demolition and rebuilding of the city. This report was based on a public-private alliance to attract a huge amount of global capital into the housing and infrastructure sectors. It suggested, funnily, the case of Shanghai as a model for Mumbai's transformation. Following the findings of the report, the government of Maharashtra launched the Dharavi redevelopment plan, including and dividing Dharavi into 5 sectors, and then inviting firms worldwide to provide free housing to the eligible slum dwellers in exchange for extra built-up area. And as is the case, this was resisted by the people of Dharavi. One, because it did not include their participation, and that the policies did not conform to their needs. Another problem was the absence of a baseline survey in the formulation of the plans, and therefore a lot of eligible slum dwellers were left out of the survey. This brought resistance by the slum dwellers, and the project to a standstill. The following years saw the emergence of social organizations, namely the Dharavi Bachao Andolan, the Dharavi Community Land Trust, which proposed as a congregation of community members, landowners, and neighborhood associations. 2019, an MOU was signed between the Maharashtra government, the Dharavi Redevelopment Project Authority, and the Dubai-based Seckling Group. The estimated cost of the project is over 26,000 crores, and it planned to transform the region into a hub of commercial and business activities. With the pandemic, the project stands still. I tried to draw references from an article by Mr. Pranjal Maheshwari, a student of architecture, titled History of the Slums of Dharavi, to explain my story here. This census map of 2001 showing the percentage of slum population varying between 15 and 60 plus percentages of the total population across different zones of Mumbai city. And it might occur to us that this has led to the mass proliferation of informal settlements. And this is probably due to the shortage of housing. But in fact, Mumbai has the highest number of vacant houses in the country. As per a 2017-18 economic survey, it has about 5 lakh vacant houses. So is the reason then the lack of sufficient formal affordable housing options in the city? Or is this solely due to the scarcity and the high cost of land? The other map here, which focuses on the accessibility and spatial distribution of dispensaries in Mumbai, highlights the presence of healthcare facilities in the city, but also indicates the absence of healthcare facilities in special planning areas that is represented by the unshaded portions which comprise informal settlements. This clearly shows a case of exclusionary practice. The second story here is of the informal settlement at Valankulam, which was developed, which actually was self-developed by migrants in the post-independence period from the neighboring districts who were trying to seek employment in the textile mills. From a very few units then, gradually the cluster expanded to nearly 820 households, expanding along the lake bed during the drought season. In 2014, when we did the urban study, this was a very vibrant community, and most of the male and the female members of the community had gainful employment in different occupations in the city. And, at the beginning, all this was on the southern fringe of the city. Over a period of time, this became the center of the city. And as happened in Mumbai, likewise, when the informal settlement starts to appear in the middle of the city, it becomes an eyesore. It becomes a predator to the city. Over the decades, this community actually self-built their houses. They've actually helped contribute to the city by way of informal employment, by doing labor, as well as the younger members of the community took to the schools and the other facilities that were available to them. But as has been the case abroad or in larger cities in India like Mumbai and Delhi, every time we see informal settlements happen, we allow them to grow. And this is what Ananya Roy writes in her book in Kolkata, Requiem, as how political agencies allow the growth and proliferation of informal settlements. And she says that this is in exchange for loyalty and votes. But later, as this starts to grow into size, it becomes it is perceived as a burden on the city. It is seen as exploiting the resources of the tax-paying citizens. And then they come up with very innovative plans, saying we'll have some slum-free city plan of action. And Coimbatore Corporation was no such exception, with central government funds coming in under different schemes, the Rajiv Awas Yojana, housing for all schemes, and the preconditions that were set in order to be eligible for these schemes and the funding that is received. Slum surveys were taken up. Households, their income, gender, their possessions were analyzed and tabled, and they start to be characterized into different types of which ones are tenable and which ones are not, and which ones are worthy to be rehabilitated by a random arbitrary date, and which ones are not, including proposing strategies for development, curative, preventive. Experience from the past clearly shows that there are no preventive strategies to stop informal settlements, marginal settlements, or squatters. All urban areas, whenever they try to think that these informal settlements will be rehabilitated into formal methods, spring a surprise, and new informal settlements happen up elsewhere in the suburban areas of the city. And this is a continuous process. So the plan of action here at Valangalam was to relocate these households into two different sites, one at Amangalam, which was 4 kilometers away, and the other at Vellaloor, which is nearly about 10 kilometers away. And like anyone would like to think that these rehabilitation projects, these relocation sites are good for the community. But over the years, the community enjoys a certain advantage by way of their location, by way of facilities that they enjoy. And these new sites, these new locations offer disadvantages. One, they splinter the community, and two, they do not have proper access, transportation, and infrastructure issues. And this coupled with high cost of transportation to reach their workplaces puts them back into the very same disadvantage that they started when they went into the slum. This early map on the left shows the Valangalam lake, and the red box that I marked in here is actually the Sungam Road junction. And this older map actually shows the lake uh, as close to the edge of the road as possible. But, but we've seen from our field studies that both along this northeastern as well as the southwestern edge of this lake, there have been encroachments and land grab, not just by poor city dwellers, but also by government agencies, including the TNEB and the TamilNadu State Transport Corporation. So while the city was becoming smart and these informal settlers were being relocated, the government agencies who happily encroached upon the lake continue to be there. And this is the kind of discriminatory practice that we would like to think about. The dry lake, as you can see in the other picture, shows the male members of the community enjoying a game of volleyball during the evenings. They also do part-time agriculture on the lake bed. And when the lake is full, they engage in fishing and other recreational activities. They use this as in the rural, people use the village commons. And the relocation sites do not offer such scope for both recreation as well as alternative resources or scope for an extra bit of earning. Image on the right top actually shows the new interventions that have been done as part of the smart city project with floating decks. And this begs to then question as to whom is the city, as to whom does the city belong to? Who holds the right to the city? Is the global image of the city or the national image of the city as a smart city and the city commons and resources and lakes meant more for the middle class and the rich? Or do the poor and the marginalized also have a say in the city? Do they also belong there? And there is a lot of double standard that one could actually see. This map from a report of the Housing and Land Rights Network shows some of the major evictions between 2017 and 19. And Smart Cities Mission Coimbatore has actually evicted 8,160 people, and so has every other major urban area in the country. And not to mention that not everybody is gifted with allotment before eviction. It's also surprising that the very reasons that agencies give for evicting people from these informal settlements, such as citing reasons of a good environment or of environmental protection or of health and better infrastructure, actually turn the other way when it comes to their own implementation. This image of an article from the News Minute mentions of how Protector turns destroyer. This is of Kalimangalam, a picturesque village which is about 30 kilometers northwest of Coimbatore. It has a population of 600 people, and this sits at the edge of the Wolvampatti Reserve Forest. For years, these people have taken part in protests and signed petitions seeking government intervention on various issues concerning the forest and the environment. But it is a little different now. This time it is to protect the forest from the government itself. The TamilNadu Slum Clearance Board has conceived a project for over 4,600 houses in the foothills, part of which is a reserve forest area. And this under the auspices of the Housing for All scheme. This has sparked massive opposition among the people for different reasons. One, the damage that the project would cause to forest resources and the environment, as well as the possibility that the people being moved here will not have enough work to sustain them. So this whole idea of the conflict with nature, deprivation of livelihood, struggle for resources, changes in the social dynamics, these are the frictions that we see in our urban areas today. The other image is that of the demolition of the houses at Mutanangolam. And this was actually a cluster of about, a large cluster of about 1,500 hutments. And initially the High Court had banned the eviction and demolition. And the legal tussle went all the way to Supreme Court, where the residents actually lost the case, and the demolition eviction drive happened right in the middle of the pandemic. Often resistance to eviction is met with stiff police action and violence. Criminal cases are registered against the slum dwellers to discourage such resistance. The social welfare committees of the housing projects mostly do not invite genuine public participation. Rather, they are a means to convince the residents to move out. And sometimes left with no other option or to evade arrest, families are forced to leave their homes and relocate. Like this image on the right shows the residents having a tussle with the enforcement people at Kakannathar in Chennai. Or the other image, which shows the construction of a new 1,640-foot wall was built in an Indian city to hide slums from the view of a foreign delegate. This was again early last year. So the point here is how do we perceive these settlements? Do we see them as predators to the urban, or do we see them as contributors to the urban? Do we see the residents as equal citizens in the city, or do we deny them rights as lesser mortals? And that brings us to the idea of inequality. In his book, Inequalities from the Perspective of the Global South, Manoranjan Mohanty highlights the paradox of the interests of the people who have been asserting their right to equality and dignity, and the focus of most governments that is prodded by the global elite, focusing on political stability, higher GDP, bigger budgets. Even though such policies have generated greater inequalities and social tensions, reducing inequality has not been their principal objective. Inequality is the uneven position or quantitative difference in which individuals, groups, regions, or other entities are placed. It is also about the conditions that allow certain groups to dominate over others. In that sense, it is a power relationship. This is important to consider because unequal power relations propel the process of more inequality or increasingly more fronts. At the same time, unless sources of power in income, wealth, knowledge, culture, and other capacities are shared, the power relationship cannot become equitable. Inequality is a cumulative condition, and while it cannot be reduced to any one aspect, even though certain aspects may be more important than others in a specific context. For example, the right to vote gives a certain political equality to all citizens as voters, irrespective of their social origin, education, income, and wealth. But economic inequality, caste, gender, religion, and racial discrimination severely limit political equity in real life, equality in real life. As an example, there are more than 50.8% of the voters in Tamil Nadu were women, but only 10% of the nearly 4,000 candidates were women. End of March last year, the announcement of a pandemic prevention lockdown triggered mass movement of several migrant groups, the majority being low-income workers across India. And reflecting back after a year, there are a few questions, crucial ones, that are raised. So why people, despite living for sometimes even decades in these cities, plan to leave? Did they not feel wanted, safe, secure, and cared? Were their concerns so grave that their families prefer to exit the city by any means? And why did administrative systems and personnel exhibit neglect and violation of human rights instead of empathy and care? And what did we do or not do for disaster management to become a disaster in itself? Was it the fear of the pandemic or the impact on the livelihood or that of preferred safety in their own native towns, villages? Was it the fear of hunger, exclusion, or discrimination? Or simply was it the lack of identity and belonging? Is this mass migration after the announcement of the lockdown then an indicator of the persistent inequalities and injustice present in our societies? As we come close to celebrating 75 years of independence with tall claims of progress and development, we continue to read about instances of discrimination and violence in our cities, towns, and villages. Are these just rare and random occurrences? Do caste, class, religion, linguistic, regional tendencies still hold key markers of urban life? How do we then, as architects, planners, designers, perceive this? How do we replan social, economic, political, spatial priorities, plans, policies, and programs? The Shaheen Bagh, the farmers' rally, the pro-Jallikattu protests show the rise of the collective consciousness of communities and groups to protect their identity, life, and fight exclusion, dispossession, and discrimination. Historically, Indian cities were segregated by caste and religion at both residence and work, and colonialism reinforced these exclusions. Independence and democracy assured in civil and political rights, including full associational freedom, but many of these exclusions have persisted. This restriction manifests itself in multiple ways, as unequal access to land and resources, as people cannot develop land by themselves for housing, but they actually do, as in the form of legality of land tenure and in the construction of employment options. This leads to informal work, housing. more restrictions, more informal outcomes. These urban inequalities are also a reflection of the state's action and policies and the systematic undermining of the right to the city. On the one hand, the city continues to serve as a playground for global competition and economic growth, often directed by priorities of the capital at the cost of well-being of the society, of the socially and economically disadvantaged urban populations. We need to implement spatial justice that focuses on the spatial dimension of the fair distribution of the burdens and benefits of urban development, and on the particular manner this distribution is managed. Ananya Roy, urban planner whose scholarship on poverty and inequalities is internationally acclaimed, argues that dealing with such informalities requires recognizing the right to the city. Henry Lefebvre imagined the right to the city entirely different, as a cry that initiated a radical struggle to move beyond both the state and capitalism. His vision, though socialist, was not in favor of state-controlled and directed socialism. His socialism insists on the collective self-governing of society, not as an ideal or worked-out society, but as an open project. By building on the theories and philosophies of Lefebvre, spatial justice links together social justice and space, most notably in the works of the geographers David Harvey and Edward Socher. Contemporary understanding likens it to the everyday experience of inhabiting the city that entitles one to a right to the city, and is understood to be a struggle to augment the rights of urban inhabitants against the property rights of owners. In conclusion, the city is often celebrated as the fullest expression of citizenship, a politico-spatial zone in which traditional barriers to participation weaken and public legality is at its strongest. But cities of the global south are breeding more inequality. Much of the hand-wringing on urban poverty and inequality in international and Indian policy documents deals with this tension by treating inequality as a residual problem, as a problem that will go away with time, with more growth, and of course, with the new elixir of good governance. But what if this inequality is not residual, but produced? What if this inequality is not something that happens to people, but results from what is done to them? What if government policies are producing inequality not because they're bad or inappropriate or corrupt, but precisely because that is the purpose, because they reflect how state power is organized and how institutions serve specific interests? What then are the futures of the field of urban planning and architecture? And what features we ought to plan for when the future that is imagined in most of the world is one of state violence, dispossession, exploitation, war, and conflict, pandemic, and climate change? Over the centuries, this scenario has shifted from the global north and the west to the entire global south. We need understanding of the ground realities of human needs, a range of creative life-making practices, and radical politics of hope in this process of reimagining. We need the dissent and freedom from the shackles of capitalist modernity and the inclusion and participation of actors outside the planning box. The working poor, undocumented migrants, socially disadvantaged groups, minorities, refugees. We need to shift planning and its core values, its vocabulary, its epistemology and rules. Planning should then be more than just a repertoire of techniques, a locus of shared affection to make life enduring by identifying and managing resources with renewed reasons and capacities, especially in a diverse subcontinent like India. We need to rethink the future of planning outside of current modernist Western dimensions that were influenced by colonizers through compulsory decentralization, by celebrating local diversities and seeking vernacular alternatives. We have to read the city through the lens of equity and justice. By focusing on the issues of democracy, justice, and redistribution, besides a focus on the technical or aesthetic aspects of this professional activity. Planning and architecture and design must not be formalizing the informal. It should be integrating the formal. Despair or hope, you decide. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for the wonderful session. I'm sure everyone was benefited by your words of wisdom, and we will take it upon us to implement it in our daily lives. We shall now move forward to the question and answer session. Before that, I request all the participants to fill the feedback form which is posted in the chat box. So we have a few questions. So we have a question from Venkatesh Babu Perumal, sir. How, as architects, can we contribute to sensitizing the public as well as the policymakers the rights of the informal settlers?
This is a tough question.
So, how, as architects, can we contribute to sensitizing the public as well as the policymakers the rights of the informal settlers?
I can read it here, Sneha. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
It's interesting because as professionals of the built environment, we sit in between the people, the users of the city, and we sit between the government, the enablers of the city. And I think this very notion of the users and the enablers also has to change first among professionals of the built environment, to think that only the government would enable or facilitate. As far as how we can contribute, I think every single small project that we do in the city can actually serve as an example to sensitize how we kind of approach the users to the space, as well as how we enable rights for all. I remember a few years back, we were in Singapore, and we had to reach out to the nearest metro station. And unlike in most developed neighborhoods in India, where the communities are all gated communities, these residential pockets absolutely had no gates, no compound walls. They allowed users to cut through their premises and take a short entry to the metro station. And that was a very sensitive development. And coming to the case of the informal settlers, I think whenever we are on the panel of the city councils, we have to assert the fact that these are people who have served the city. They're not predators. And therefore they have rights. And despite not owning the land where they are is actually collective public land, common resources. And by virtue of their contribution to the society, they deserve to live there. So there are many things we can do as architects to actually contribute. I think I can only think of so much. The other question is your own question, Shweta. No, not from Sneha, from Shweta. Okay, will the pandemic accelerate the mainstreaming of health criteria into the design of public spaces? See, I think this question again goes back to some of the priorities of the public policies. Most of the developed nations of the North and West actually spend a lot on health and education, and it's public funded. In India, are kind of spending on health and education, public health and education is less than 1% of the GDP. So we're only doing a kind of quick responses whenever there is a disaster, and then we forget about it conveniently once it's over. So whether it will accelerate the mainstreaming of health criteria, I truly do not know, but it should, ideally it should. And that should reflect in how we kind of design our public spaces. Ideally it should, but unfortunately, the past year of what we've seen after the first wave of the pandemic was not a rosy picture. Health infrastructure was not crucially developed to the extent to which we would like to see it for our populations. And there is a concern there. And that's the kind of question I want to ask. What do you see there? Do you see despair or hope? And it might sound a little, difficult to digest, but most of the time it's one of despair. It's because you see people helping themselves, which is a good situation, but it's not a very ideal situation because not everyone has the same circumstances. So, yes, Neha?
So we have one more question.
Okay. Please.
Sir, will the temporary transformation seen during the crisis inspire more permanent solutions?
See, our human nature is once out of sight, we forget. Okay, and as a country, we have our own challenges, and we are firefighting most of the time. So the temporary transformation we are seeing here, like I mentioned, they should inspire. They should ideally promote more, kind of solutions that are more people friendly, that are more inclusive, that are more just, and that kind of tend to cater to everyone, and they should be there ideally. But then I do not know whether this is the case of just financial limitations, or that of the thought process of how we see people. And this is why I'd like to say that, and this is where there's a certain neglect, or there is a certain exclusion that we often see. So permanent solutions are required. We have to see things ahead of time. We have to be ready for pandemics, for climate change, natural calamities, for several other things, for other challenges, for urban challenges. Chennai during the floods happened right in front of us. Have you seen permanent solutions? What do you expect? Do you see despair or hope?
So we have one more question by Subhadashika. Do we need a new typology for public space?
See, this whole idea of land ownership. This whole idea of land ownership is something that we will have to shed to a certain extent, and perceive our cities and towns and villages as collective resources, despite the ownership. So I would like to see the entire region as a public space. Despite my ownership, I would like to see it as a public space where I might have my own privacy, and documented ownership. I also allow, a free kind of a movement of people, as long as it does not, cause any destruction or, you know, it's difficult to say in a country like India because, informality is the norm and encroachment is the norm. So, but then we'll have to work around it. And I think it's possible. And not just in the kind of creating a new typology for public space, but in how we visualize the entire, you know, urban region or all our resources as collective resources. This might sound like a certain kind of a socialist idea, but ideally, I think there has to be some middle path.
So we have one more question by architect Arun Kumar. It is a wonderful and insightful presentation. The government, in spite of having EWS allocations in the building plan norms, still the deprived is not being given the opportunity. What is your opinion on that, and how is this being addressed in other countries such as Europe?
That's a very difficult question. See, we've often seen, countries kind of do the same mistakes and follow the same kind of strategies again and again of trying to, dispossess, of trying to, kind of evict people, and then trying to bring in alternate solutions, of trying to encourage public participation and not being able to do so to encourage private participation, and then expect private players who are hardcore business entities to actually show social concern. I think we're having genuine faults there in our approach. So on one side, on the other side, like I mentioned, the social inequalities are actually witnessed as spatial inequalities. So the kind of practices, cultural practices that we see, a recent a report on the internet, I read about how different communities in India perceive tolerance and segregation among the different communities in India. Gave some very interesting highlights. They said while the different religious communities in India are tolerant of other religions, they would like to see people segregated. So this is something we'll have to live with. To have mixed communities in terms of religion, in terms of language, in terms of class and income, requires a very big social housing project. In my opinion, requires a larger understanding of key challenges that we face here. In the West and Europe, it's pretty simple because there's not so much of a social dynamics at play. Things are a lot more easier to accommodate, although it's not that easy, but it is relatively. So deprived not being given the opportunity in the allocations, see, this can only be answered in one way. Why do people have to live in an informal settlement? Why do people have to build by themselves? Why do they not go out, reach out to formal opportunities of work and housing? Then comes the question of whether they have the opportunities, the skill, and decent remuneration to live in a city. For example, in a report I read about Mumbai, it says it talks about the living costs and about housing in Mumbai, and says only 5% can actually afford to buy a house in Mumbai. Now, this does not speak well for any urban region. If only 5% can buy a house or afford a house, then what about the rest 95? So where is our threshold? Our minimum threshold, our income thresholds need to match the ground realities. And people will then definitely take good care of themselves, and they would support the city, so, and the community. So I think that's how it has to be. This is requires a social revolution probably. We are seeing this in other parts of the world where people are asking for uh, for their rights to the resources. But we are seeing in India that's not happening. We are seeing how tribal communities in Chhattisgarh and Jharkhand are being relieved of their land so that private entities can do their mining. And we are seeing this in several countries in Africa. So this is a big challenge. Resources have to be evenly distributed in certain income form to all residents, to all people. I hope that kind of answers to my friend Arun Kumar.
Thank you,
Yes.
sir. As we're running out of time, the remaining questions will be sent to the speaker and the answers for the same will be posted on our social media platforms. I would once again like to thank our title sponsor, Madan's Makeover, a tailor-made salon. And last but not least, I would like to call upon our HOD of SRM Seed, Professor Asok Kumar sir, to deliver the vote of thanks.
So you were on mute, sir.
You're on mute, sir.
Yeah, good afternoon, one and all present here. On behalf of SRM Seed, School of Environment, Architecture and Design, Ramapuram, I thank our Mohammad Ali Sharieff, architect, research scholar, doing a wonderful presentation. Really, it's an impactful presentation during this pandemic time. And of course, sir, it's a very well you explained on this the informal settlement, whether it's a despair or hope. And we thank you for your gesture and sharing your knowledge and experience and the research on this informal settlements from the prehistoric pre-independence period. You explained from today's pandemic situation, sir. And of course,